Wichita State basketball, they were certainly a random powerhouse out of the Missouri Valley Conference over the course of about 7 years. But what happened to Wichita State that led to their downfall? They did have a legitimate college Big Three led by Fred Van Fleet, Ron Baker, and Clay Anthony Early. I'm going to be discussing the rise of Wichita State and the recent fall and where they are today. So, Wichita State originally out of the Missouri Valley Conference, a very lightly recruited, lightly regarded league, hired Greg Marshall back in 2007. They got him from Winthrop, and I'm actually surprised looking back on Greg Marshall's resume. He had a crazy run with Winthrop where he made the tournament 3 straight years. In 2005, he went 15-1 in conference. 2006, he went 13-3. In 2007, he went 14-0. So he was very impressive. And with his coaching trajectory on an uptrend after 3 straight NCAA tournament appearances, he did actually make the round of 32 his final season with Winthrop. He signed on with Wichita State in 2007, and his first year with the Shockers was not very good, finishing 11-20, just 4-14 in the Missouri Valley Conference. 2008, slight improvement at 17-17. They did make the CBI tournament. I don't know if you guys know all the other tournaments outside of March Madness. You've got the NIT, you've got the CBI. I think there's another one. There might even be a lower one, or maybe the CBI is the lowest one. But really, it wasn't until his third season at Wichita State that Greg Marshall really started turning around the Shockers program, finishing 25-10. They were a very respectable 12-6 in the Missouri Valley Conference, finishing second, and they did make the NIT. So 25 wins after going 500, and before that they were 9 games under 500. You can see the trajectory of Wichita State is on the uptrend. In the 2011 season, Wichita State nearly won 30 games, finishing 29-8. 14-4 in the Missouri Valley Conference and winning the NIT championship. So Greg Marshall's first 4 years at Wichita State, 0 NCAA appearances, but 2 NIT appearances, and winning the entire NIT tournament his 4th year with the Shockers. And then the first year I really want to get into, as the program is building and the trajectory is going up, Wichita State finishes 2012 with a 27-6 record. They went 16-2 in conference, finished first in the conference, and made the NCAA tournament. And they finished 9th in terms of overall analytics according to T-Rank. They were a 5 seed. Unfortunately for them, they were involved in the ever-famous 12v5 upset, losing to Virginia Commonwealth by 3 points, 62-59. But little did anyone know, the year after that, they would make the Final Four. Yes, in 2013, Wichita State had a 30-win season. They only went 12-6 in conference play, but it was a tougher Missouri Valley Conference in 2013, and they were a 9 seed. So basically what that means, you're going to face an 8 seed, and then if you beat an 8 seed, you immediately get a 1 seed, and they made a crazy run to the Final Four, led by Carl Hall at the time, and also Clay Anthony Early. Ron Baker and Fred Van Fleet were also on this team, but they were more so role players. Van Fleet barely played as a freshman, and Ron Baker was more of just a 3-point specialist, but their run was very impressive. So they beat the 8 seed Pittsburgh by 18 points. In the second round, they beat Gonzaga, the number 1 overall seed in the region, by 6. They get a little bit lucky facing LaSalle in the third round, the number 13 seed. They win that game. Then they face the number 2 seed Ohio State, win by 4. And then they ended up losing in the Final Four by 4 points as a 9 seed to Louisville. That was the year Louisville went on to win the national title and had it vacated with Rick Pitino. They beat Michigan. But what a year for Wichita State, and that set up an absolutely crazy 2014 year, the height of the Shockers' reign. Starting the season 34-0, certainly taking advantage of the Missouri Valley Conference, but this was Clay Anthony Early in his senior year. This was Ron Baker with a few years of experience, and this was Fred Van Fleet, who as a sophomore had his best season in college and was the best player on this team out of the big three. When it comes to Fred Van Fleet, Clay Anthony Early, and Ron Baker. None of them were highly regarded recruits, although I will say Fred VanVleet was the only player in the Rivals 150 to commit to a Missouri Valley school, although it wasn't like he was this big shot top 50 overall player. He was a fringe 4-star according to a few services. There were a few services that didn't even have Fred VanVleet ranked. Clay Anthony Early was a junior college superstar and had multiple big-time offers, but did end up committing to Wichita State. And Ron Baker had dreamed of playing for Kansas. He grew up in the state, but he never came close to receiving an offer and ended up committing to Wichita State, redshirting his freshman season. We're going to get to what those guys did in terms of their pro careers, but just getting back, how crazy is it? 34-1. Certainly, if Wichita State was in a Power 5 conference, even the Pac-12, they're not going undefeated. It's just very hard to win every single game, especially in conference play when you're constantly facing decent teams. The Missouri Valley Conference, it's just, they took advantage of it, and you give them credit for it, but it wasn't like this was a gauntlet of a schedule, and they were a number 1 seed, obviously, entering the tournament at 33-0, and they had probably one of the craziest games, at least just for me. They faced Cal Poly, and it's just such a weird dynamic to see Wichita State as a 1 seed face Cal Poly in the first round, because you would never expect it. You know, you expect Kentucky to face Cal Poly. You expect Duke to face Cal Poly, not Wichita State. So it was just a weird game, and they won that game 64-37. That was a 1v16 matchup. Cal Poly scoring under 40 points, and then they lose in round 2. Everyone says they got screwed with this draw, considering they were undefeated going into the tournament. They were a 1 seed. They were not respected. They faced a very tough 8 seed Kentucky, and they lost by 2 points with VanVleet Early and Ron Baker. This would have been their best year, where they were ranked as the AP number 1 team, undefeated entering the tournament, and they don't even make the Sweet 16. It was demoralizing, but Wichita State, you know, because you do have the buffer of the Missouri Valley Conference, because you are returning at that point both Ron Baker and Fred VanVleet, in 2015 they were able to rearm. They did finish as a 7 seed. They made the Sweet 16. They won 29 games, and in the Missouri Valley Conference they went 17-1, so back-to-back crazy good years. You go 18-0 in conference play, 17-1 the next year, and they did make the Sweet 16, losing to a very good Notre Dame team. That was the year Notre Dame almost beat Kentucky, when Kentucky had that crazy squad with Karl Anthony Towns, the Harrison twins. You remember that? Wichita State, entering that tournament run as a 7 seed, had to match up with the number 2 seed Kansas in the second round and won by 13. So they had a very nice showing in 2015. And in 2016, another decent year for them. I will say, when you look at their seed rank versus their analytics, it seems like Wichita State was consistently underseeded. In terms of these analytical rankings I'm looking at, they finished at number 10 in the nation, but they were an 11 seed. And the reason I think that was the case was because they just weren't getting quality wins in the Missouri Valley Conference. Analytics tend to reward you if you blow out teams. It was easy for Wichita State to blow out teams and win in a dominant fashion because of the conference that they were in. But another year in the Missouri Valley Conference in 2016, they go 16-2. So that's 3 straight years, 18-0, 17-1, 16-2 in the Missouri Valley Conference for Wichita State. But they were just an 11 seed, and they had to play in the play-in. So they faced another 11 seed in the first 4, Vanderbilt. They beat them by 20. Then they beat the 6 seed Arkansas before losing to Miami by 8 points. At that point, Fred VanVleet and Ron Baker were still at the school. They were upperclassmen. And you also had Landry Shamet come onto the map, who is now currently an NBA player. He would have been the 3rd best player on that team that ended up making the Sweet 16. Moving on to 2017, Wichita State, another very solid year, finishing 31-5, 17-1 in conference. They just owned the Missouri Valley Conference. They beat Dayton in the first round, who was a 7 seed, and then lost to Kentucky by only 3 points, who was a 2 seed. That team was led by Marcus McDuffie and Landry Shamet. And Austin Reeves was also on that team. Reeves was with Wichita State for 2 years before transferring and breaking out at Oklahoma. He was a 4-year college player. But moving on to 2018, Wichita State, another very solid year. This was actually a very big year in terms of their future as a basketball program, considering after dominating the Missouri Valley Conference for well over half a decade, they did join the American, and the American at the time, now it's a little bit worse with teams leaving, but it was a really good conference and a very nice showing by Wichita State, finishing 25-8, but getting a very respectable 4 seed. If they were 25-8 in the Missouri Valley Conference, they likely would have been an 8 or a 9 seed. Unfortunately for them, they were the victim of a first-round upset, losing to the 13 seed Marshall Thundering Herd. They lost 81-75 in that game. Landry Shamet had a really, really good year. Extremely efficient offensive year, but then the downfall truly started for Wichita State. And when it comes to Wichita State's downfall, the way they were able to acquire talent and Greg Marshall was able to, get some of these kids, it was rather peculiar. I'm not going to say it was a fluke, but it's not like Wichita State was recruiting like solid 4-star players. I mean, these kids were just out of nowhere, basically, outside of Fred VanVleet. But even him, he was like a low 4-star. But Cleanthony Early came from junior college. Ron Baker was barely a 3-star. He wasn't even ranked on most services. And Wichita State in 2019 finished 22-15 and just 10-8 in conference. They did not make the NCAA tournament. In 2020, Wichita State would have made the tournament. It got canceled. They went 23-8. They were projected to be around a 6 seed, so a decent year there for Greg Marshall. I think Greg Marshall's a really good coach, but he was forced to resign in November of 2020. So this would have been the 2021 year going into it. After an investigation and multiple former players had alleged they were dealing with physical and verbal abuse from Greg Marshall, he was, however, paid $7.5 million by Wichita State for his resignation, and he has not coached anywhere since. So Greg Marshall out at Wichita State going into the 2021 season, and it has been a complete fall off at this point for Wichita State. Unfortunately for them, they did finish 16-6 in 2021. Kind of a weird situation where a bunch of games must have been canceled because of the pandemic restrictions, and they were in the first 4, but they lost that. In 2022, they went 15-13, 6-9 in conference play. They missed the tournament outright. 2023, it was basically the same thing. Wichita State is trending down as a program. As for their big 3, Cleanthony Early did get drafted in the second round with the 34th pick by the New York Knicks. So almost a first rounder, early second rounder with that 34th pick. He did play with the Knicks for 3 seasons sporadically as a bench player, but he has been out of the NBA since. Fred VanVleet was undrafted, but he made quite the career with the Toronto Raptors, winning an NBA championship. He currently has the record for the most amount of points in an NBA game by an undrafted free agent, scoring 54, and he did parlay that into a big deal. At this point, though, he's pretty much washed playing with the Houston Rockets. And then Ron Baker, another player that played with the Knicks for a few years, he also went undrafted. So it's kind of interesting. Wichita State had this team that was 34-0 at one point in college. Their 3 best players on that team, one of them was a second-round pick, and the other 2 went undrafted. But Ron Baker did play with the Knicks for a few years. He latched on with the Hawks for a year, but he is out of the NBA. So that is the story on Wichita State, their rise, their fall. I think it just comes down to what happened to Greg Marshall. I mean, when you've got a team like Wichita State, there is some luck that goes into it because you're not constantly bringing in elite talent, especially out of the Missouri Valley Conference. And when they did make the move to the American, the Missouri Valley Conference, and when they did make the move to the American, it became that much harder. Now, the American, I guess, technically is easier because a lot of American teams got poached and ended up going to the Big 12 because the Big 12 lost teams. All of this has to do with college football realignment, but either way, that is the story of Wichita State. That's going to do it for this video. Make sure you follow me on X. Link to that's always in the description.